All right, so let's get started. Hello, everyone. This is Naman, and I welcome you all to Executive IAS. Today, we are going to start with lecture number second of International Relation lecture series. If I would have to take you briefly towards the yesterday's lecture, in yesterday's lecture, we have mainly discussed about the historical aspect of IR, where we have briefly discussed about the world history of 20th century and 21st century and the relevant IR upholding of the world and the relation that India has with it and the consequences that we had seen in our country, right, which shaped the IR policy of the different powers of different times. So this is what is the glimpse of yesterday's lecture. All right. In today's lecture, we are mainly going to talk about the IR, the definition of IR, the determinants of IR. We will be talking about India's foreign policy. All right. We will be talking about various objectives of different leaders or different governments of our country. Then we will be talking about the principles that have shaped our foreign policy, right? So this is what today's lecture will look like. So without any further ado, let's get started. All right, so what is the foreign policy, right? The definition, you should always keep this definition ready, right? Because you can write it universally. All right, so what is foreign policy? It is basically a mechanism that national governments, right, they use to guide their interactions and relationships with other countries. All right, so it is a mechanism, it is an institutions, right, that government they use to guide their interactions and various relationships with other countries, right? So you might be knowing who this particular individual is, right? If you do know him, then please leave in the comment his name. What is the name of this particular person? Please leave in the comment. And I'm expecting you all that you might be knowing this particular guy, right? He is very prima donna, very sought after guy when it comes to international relation, and also inspiration for people like me, and I'm hoping for all of you as well. All right, so he is a godlike figure when it comes to IR. All right, so what are the various determinants of foreign policy? All right, determinants. When I say determinants, what do I mean? So determinants is basically the different factors which shapes the foreign policy of country, right? Which decides where the foreign policy is swaying to or going to. All right, so what are the different determinants? It is military power, all right, technology, geography, population, history, and etc. We will be seeing the determinants in much more detail. All right, so for now, just have the idea that the more military power you have, the more you will be having your stance in the international relation, right? For example, we know the United States. Similarly, technology, geography, right? The strategic location, and then population, right? India is known for its demographic dividend, right? And that is why we have become one of the very prominent player when it comes to IR, right? Then history. These are some of the determinants of IR. All right, now let's see Indian foreign policy or India's foreign policy, right? Here we will be talking about the civilizational aspect of India's foreign policy, right? From very ancient time to today's time, how did we traverse to such a more pragmatic, realistic foreign policy? All right. So the policy of promoting one's ideals, interests, and objectives and other principle is referred to as the foreign policy. This is also the definition that you can use, right? It is policy of promoting one's ideals, interest, objectives, and other principles is basically foreign policy, right? We all might be knowing that UN, how strongly we criticize about the world terrorism, right? And we strongly stand against it. So we are kind of promoting our interest, our ideals, and our principles of anti-terrorism, right? So this is what is the foreign policy of our country, which constantly changes in response to changing conditions, right? What do I mean? That foreign policy changes in response to the changing condition, right? Once upon a time, During the time of our country's independence, our foreign policy was strongly on anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, right? But as in today's time, there are no longer colonial sentiments that is prevailing around the world. We mainly have changed or evolved our foreign policy to more realistic policies, right? Of anti-terrorism, of supply chain issues, of semiconductor crisis, of technology, and etc. and etc. Right. So this is what it means when we say that foreign policy changes in response to the changing conditions, right? Both at the domestic level and international stage, right? So what is our history tells about our Indian foreign policy, right? Our Indian history. So India is one of the most ancient civilizations in the world, right? So there were 4 to 5 civilizations around the world, right? So Harappan Indus Valley civilization was the one. Then we know Yellow River civilization in China was the one, right? Then we have some Greek civilizations, right? We have a Mesopotamian civilization, etc., right? So uh, we all might be aware that how avidly we were interacting when it comes to trade and commerce during very ancient times of our history, right? So India's foreign policy remained independent whether it was the Mauryan Empire, the Gupta Empire, or the Mughal Empire. So our foreign policy was never divided or segregated between the world politics or world power, right? Like in today's case, we have USA and USSR or Russia, right? So our foreign policy was always independent. It was always autonomous, right? We know how Mauryan Empire, like Mauryan kings like Ashoka, he has made sure that his son and daughter they go to Sri Lanka to propagate his religion, that is Buddhism, right? And how interestingly it was accepted wholeheartedly, it was accepted around the world, right? So this is what our foreign policy was, to promote the ideals of Vasudeva Kutumbakam, right? That entire globe is a family, right? Similarly with Gupta Empire and Mughals Empire too, right? So when we talk about the Britishers, right? So Britishers were also the important determinants of India's foreign policy, though they used our foreign policy for their own benefits, right? Uh, Britishers they designed our India's foreign policy because we were the colony of British, right? We were the colony of Britain. So our foreign policy was mainly to fill their coffers, to benefit them, right? So this was all about the colonial period, right? But after independence, India's foreign policy is again fulfilling Indian interest, right? So this is the evaluation or the evolvement of the foreign policy that we are talking about. How did we move from the an ancient civilization to to the several empires, colonies, and etc. to present times, right? To present times post independence, right? So Britain's foreign policy, they were the major determinants of India's foreign policy. They have derived or they have laid the foundation of foreign policy in our country when it comes to international relation, right? But their foreign policy was mainly driven towards their own benefit, their own self interest, right? The foreign policy of India or any country is shaped by two factors, right? And what are the two factors? The two factors, we will make a chart here, all right? So two factors are, one is domestic and one is international. So these are the two factors uh, by which the foreign policy of any country is shaped, all right? So what are the domestic factors when we talk about domestic? So basically culture, geography, economy, they play a important domestic factor in the foreign policy, right? They are the uh, important factor when it comes to this deciding one's foreign policy, right? Not only about history, culture, or geography or economy, even our population, right? Our population play very crucial role. Our diaspora plays very crucial role. Our culture plays very crucial role, right? Our economy, trade, of course, our history plays very crucial role, right? This is what our cultures, different cultures like films, our festivals, our different celebrations, and etc. is very a crucial key role. They play a key role in deciding one's foreign policy, right? As we know, like in Central Asian countries like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and etc., our Indian films and etc., they are very, very famous, right? They are very, very famous. People, they might not know who the Narendra Modi is, who the present Prime Minister of our country is, but they will know who the Rajesh Khanna is or Amitabh Bachchan is. That is how important the culture plays in the decision of foreign policy, right? And the international factors, they are marked basically by the Cold War, rivalry between NATO, the Warsaw Pact, the founding of the UN, the weapon race during the Cold War, right? And notably the nuclear arms race, anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism. So these are some of the factors, some of the important key points that play important role when it comes to international factor of foreign policy, right? So Cold War, the ideological rivalry between USA and USSR, right? Which in 1989, with the collapse of USSR, this Cold War is considered to be ended, right? Then there is a rivalry between the NATO and the Warsaw Pact, right? If I have to give you just a brief idea, NATO is basically a ally of the United States, and Warsaw Pact was basically the allies of the Russia, right? The USSR. The founding of the UN, the United Nations, right? Post World War II, and the weapons race, right? During the Cold War, we know how crucial it was, the weapon race, right? Then notably the nuclear arms race. We know the nuclear arm race, non-proliferation treaties, and etc. Then ideologies like anti-colonialism and anti-imperialism, they also played very, very crucial role in deriving foreign policy when it comes to internationally, right? So these are some of the important unfoldings in India's civilizational foreign policy, right? And evolution thereafter. So when we talk about foreign policy, there are mainly three A's that are taken into consideration, right? Remember this, these three A's. What are the three A's? This is basically space for strategic autonomy, right? There should be a space, enough space for strategic autonomy, right? We talk about the principle of national interest, right? That every country have right to promote their national interest beneficial to their own country, right? So this is what is the space that countries must have in order to promote their national autonomy, right? Or strategic autonomy. What is the second S? It is basically stability, right? Both within and in the neighborhood, there should be stability within the country and also in the neighborhood. And the third S is basically the strength, right? Strength, economic, military, soft power to protect advanced Indian interest, right? These are some of the important determinants of the foreign policy, right? So what are the three S? Basically the space, not the space, the science space, but the space for a strategic autonomy, right? Then the second one is the stability within the country and also within the neighborhood, right? And third one is the basically strength, right? The more strength you have when it comes to military power, technology, geography, and soft power and etc., right? Indian diaspora, for example, culture, for example, right? The more strategic foreign policy you will be able to devise and meet the ऑब्जेक्टिव्स ऑफ इंडियन फॉरेन पॉलिसी, राइट? आपने जो भी ऑब्जेक्टिव्स बनाया है अपने फॉरेन पॉलिसी को लेके, यू विल बी एबल टू मीट देम इजली, राइट? So today India is in selected countries of the world in military field, space, religious, culture, and etc. And India has used them better in its foreign policy formulation, right? As we know today how successful the G20 gathering was in New Delhi, right? September last year in Bharat Mandapam. Why? Because of the various strength in military field, space, religious, culture, and etc. that we possess, right? So this is what is the importance of the three S that we take into consideration when it comes to foreign policy. Now let's talk about various objectives of the India's foreign policy from the post-independence time to present times, right? What were the various objectives of various power or the governments of our country, right? So multifarious objectives of Indian foreign policy achieve a blend of national and international interest, right? So our policy, our objective was not always domestically driven, right? It was not always for our own benefit. It was also sometimes to take into consideration the international interest, right? When it comes to Russia Ukraine war, India has always stood against the war, right? India has strongly condemned Russia that this is not the time for war. This is a time for cooperation, collaboration, and the mutual benefit, right? This is not the time of war. So India's objectives of foreign policy has also taken international interest into consideration. India has sought to achieve its security, socio-economic advancement, while at the same time working for peace, freedom, progress, and justice to all nations and peoples. Right. So when we talk about the domestic interest of our country, we have always advanced our national interest of security, socio-economic advancement. Right. So security, we talk about trans-border terrorism and etc. Socio-economic advancement, right? We talk about the barriers, tariffs, and etc. Right? The unfair treatment by World Trade Organization of different countries, right? So we have always made sure to advance the issues of socio-economic advancement and security when it comes to domestic affairs of our country, right? So now let's see what are some of the different objectives of our country when it comes to foreign policy. So first and foremost objective is that our foreign policy, it aims to safeguard and further the national interest in terms of protecting the country's political independence, right? Political independence in terms of sovereignty, right? Sovereignty. For our country, our sovereignty is utmost priority, right? And the foreign policy can be devised accordingly in order to safeguard our political independence or the sovereignty and promoting its external security, right? The second objective is seeks to promote world peace, prevent or resist military threats, support to the initiative for disarmament, peaceful neighborhood, and work to avoid wars, right? So initiatives for disarmament, we have always promoted the idea of NPT, non-proliferation treaty, NPT, right? But we have always also promoted the idea of civil utilization of the nuclear resources, right? Civil utilization in the sense using nuclear for nuclear the resources for power generations, right? And etc. So these are some of the important objectives when it comes to promoting national interest, that is domestic affairs, security, sovereignty, and world peace, prevent and resist military threats, support to the initiative for disarmament, peace, neighborhood, and work to avoid wars, right, in international affairs. I'm hoping that you guys are getting the concepts. All right. So keep taking a note as well simultaneously, right? You can use these particular titles like basic objectives of Indian foreign policy and etc. and try jotting down some key points. I will make sure to share these slides as well with all of you so that you can um, directly have a look of the slide and can revise effectively. All right. So the third objective is to promote harmony and cooperation between the countries that have ideological, political, and other differences, right? So the countries who have political or ideological differences, let's say China is mainly driven by communist ideology and US is mainly driven by the liberal democratic ideology, right? So there might be a ideological difference between both of them, right? So India foreign policy will always ensure that there is a harmony and cooperation between the ideological differential nations, right? To direct its foreign policy towards realization of equal rights of all people and nations without discrimination, right? So we always talk about the human rights. We always talk about the human right. So recently there has been several crises around the world, right? Like earthquake in Turkey and etc. And we have started our Operation Dost, right? Operation Dost by sending relief aid in Turkey, right? So this was mainly aimed at safeguarding the rights and welfare of the people without discrimination. Though we do not have a well-grounded, a friendly relation with Turkey, but still we ensure that we send our relief team to Turkey for Operation Dost so that we can ensure that the welfare, the safeguarding, and the equal rights of all people and nations without discrimination is safeguarded and protected, right? Which is important objective of our national foreign policy, right? The The fifth one is leveraging international partnership to promote India's domestic development, right? And the last one is advancing Indian representation and leadership on matters of global governance, right? So these are some of the important foreign policy, the objectives of our country's foreign policy, right? So what is objective? Basically, our foreign policy will be devised, it will be decided in order to ensure that these particular objectives of our country are met, right? So this is kind of directive principles when it comes to foreign policy of our nation, right? So now let's see what are some of the principles that have guided India's foreign policy, right? Principles are the framework which helps the policymakers to devise the foreign policy of our country, right? So these are some of the principles. Panchashil, right? Panchashil was a very, very strongly advocate of our honorable Prime Minister Sri Jawaharlal Nehru post independence, right? So what is Panchashil? It is basically the five principles, five principles given by Jawaharlal Nehru when it comes to foreign policy objective, right? And what was the five principle? It was mutual non-aggression, mutual cooperation, mutual respect for each and for sovereign territories, then mutual benefit to each countries, right? And these are some of the five Panchashil principles which was promoted by the Jawaharlal Nehru, right? And during the time of post independence, we mainly were driven by the non-aligned foreign policy, right? Non-alignment, where we did not align with any of the major power of the world, right? For example, America or the USSR, right? We mainly followed the principle of non-alignment, right? And what was that foreign policy driven by? That particular foreign policy was driven by the principle of Panchashil, right? We will not interfere, we will not show any aggressive tendency, we will not uh, we will ensure that there is a mutual benefit and etc and etc, right? Similarly with China, right? We have always thought that China is a Hindi chini bhai bhai, right? But that did not uh, happen as we thought, right? That is why it was considered to be an idealist principle, right? Idealist principle जो उस टाइम शायद उतना रियलिस्ट नहीं था, उतना प्रैक्टिकल नहीं था, उतना pragmatic it was not there, right? So that is why it was not so successful, right? So then we talk about non-alignment. As we have already discussed, then non-alignment was basically non-aligning with any of the major power blocks, right? And being stuck into the power politics. The third one was anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, and anti-racism, right? So we have ensured to promote the ideas and principles of countries of global south, right? We have ensured that there is a anti-imperialism, anti-racism in African continents and etc, right? So these were the principles. The fourth one, the principle of avoiding use of force in setting difference with other countries, right? So we have no first use policy, no first use policy, no first use policy when it comes to nuclear attack, right? Nuclear attack, we do not have no first use policy, right? So this particular policy is mainly driven by the principle of avoiding use of force in settling difference with other countries. And fifth principle is strengthening the United Nations and other global and regional organizations and development of international law as useful tools, right? So recently in G7 countries, the 49th G7 countries, the last one, basically India has raised a voice when it comes to inefficiency of UN, right? That India have raised the voice that UN is not anymore efficient in resolving the conflict, right? If UN would have been efficient, then there would have been no war between Russia and Ukraine, right? That is why India has strongly raised the voice against the UN, that UN must be now redesigned, which should be more inclusive and would be able to resolve the conflict much more efficiently, right? So this is what are the five principles that have mainly driven our foreign policy, right? So in short, though foreign policy, India wants to be seen as peace loving, mature, law abiding and trustworthy country, while trying to benefit from friendly contacts with other countries in the society of nation, right? So this is what the India is trying to brand itself as, right? India wants to brand peace loving, mature, abiding, and etc. The world rule and etc and etc, but at the same time we are also following a more realistic path when it comes to foreign policy in order to safeguard our own national interest, right? So these were some of the objectives and principles of India's foreign policy. All right, so now let's talk about the evaluation of India's foreign policy, right? So as you can see in the picture, you can see Jawaharlal Nehru, right, as our first PM. Then we can see Indira Gandhi. Then we can see Atal Bihari Vajpayee, right? Then we can see Dr. Manmohan Singh, and finally the Prime Minister Modi, right? So these were some of the important phases when it comes to IR of our country, right? So you can see how Modi ji and Trump are hugging each other, right? So that shows a more pragmatic approach of IR. All right. So this is something, the picture is very, very intense. It can summarize the entire evolution of IR. All right. So the evolution of India's foreign policy can be traced back to India's pre-independence. All right, as we know, um, that India's pre-independence, like during the Britishers, they have laid the foundation of our India's foreign policy, right? And not only of Britishers, even the INC, right, Indian National Congress, and their movements, it have also articulated about India's foreign policy, right? So the meeting of All India Congress Committee in New Delhi in 1921, right? A landmark in the history of India's foreign relation, right? So the first time meeting of All India Congress Committee in New Delhi in 1921. So if you look at this particular year of 1921, it was a kind of a succession of the World War One, right? World War One ended in 1920s, and immediately after 20s, the first time there was a All India Congress Committee meeting in New Delhi, which was held at 1921. And there, the All India Congress Committee, they have said that the Congress passed a resolution which says that the present government, right, the British resign of India in no way represents India's opinion, right? Because if you look at the World War One closely, Britain was important player in World War One, right? And they have exploitatively used Indian resources in World War One, right? That is why just after the war got over, the All India Congress Committee, they met at New Delhi. They have passed the resolution that the present government or the British government of India in no way represents Indian opinion, right? Because Indians were against the war, right? But British, they have used the Indian resources, Indian forces, India's police and etc., India's men in fighting the war in Europe, right? That is why this becomes a landmark historical precedent when it comes to India's foreign policy. All right, this can become also a question of prelims, right? That India's foreign policy, which event is landmark in the history of India's foreign relations. So it was All India Congress Committee meeting in New Delhi, which was held in 1921, right? So it was during the course of India's struggle for independence that All India Congress Committee passed another important resolution in its session held at Madras in 1927. So when we talk about India's foreign policy, right, the India's true foreign policy, not the Britishers, the first important landmark event was in 1921 when All India Congress Committee met in New Delhi, and they have passed a resolution saying that in no way the present government represents the Indians' opinion, right? Then the second important event that happened was in 1927, right? 1927, as we all know, that there was a Madras meeting, right? Meeting of All India Congress Committee held in Madras, right? They basically stressed on the need to conduct independently the external relations of India with the rest of the world without the interference of the British government, right? The first time they have realized how important the international affairs was, and they have decided to conduct independently the external relation of India with the rest of the world, right? And there is the time where India started talking to the major powers of the world related to its independence, right? and even USSR and even America, they have coaxed to the Britain that India should get its independent as soon as possible, right? So this is what it helped India to promote its national interest, its true national interest, and not of the Britishers, right? So this is how important the happening of 1927 in Madras becomes, right? Indeed, the foundation of India's foreign policy had been laid down at the Madras session of the Congress. So the foundation for foreign policy is said to be laid during the Madras session of the Congress in 1927, right? So remember this, right? The foundation of the India's foreign policy had been laid down at the Madras session of the Congress, all right, in the 1927. So let's let's see a brief assessment of Congress resolution from 1921 to 1947, right? So they have met several times at different places from New Delhi to Madras to Lucknow. uh, what is the assessment that we can do of India's foreign policy, right? So the first and foremost idea that they were acutely aware of the dangers in the growth of fascism, right? So we saw a rise of fascism in countries like Germany, right? Germany. So Germany, so which strongly influenced the Congress idea, and they were aware that how the regime can turn into fascism, right? Then a sympathetic approach to the aspirations of the Soviet Union, right? So, say Soviet Union, they were trying to do a socialist revolution, right? So that is also shaped India's foreign policy, right? And post independence, we also kind of walked a path of Soviet Union when it comes to India's economy, right? Then the third important assessment is a consistent criticism of the continuation or expansion of Western imperial power anywhere in the world, right? Because the main reason of World War One was the Western expansion of imperial power in the different parts of the world, right? We know how Germany, Austria, Hungary, and etc. they started expanding to Poland and different parts of Europe, and because of that, there was a conflict that has taken shape, right? And the fourth important assessment is the sensitive exposure of all forms of racial, social, and economic discrimination, right? So these are the various assessment of India's Congress Committee in different resolution which has been passed in 1921 to 1947, right? So we were acutely aware about the fascism, we were strongly against fascism, right? Even Mahatma Gandhi, he wrote a letter to Hitler. He addressed Hitler as my dear brother Hitler, whatever you are doing is not right, right? So this is how we are strongly against fascism. We were kind of inclined towards the vision of Soviet Union of bringing socialist revolution in Russia, right? Then consistent criticism of expansion of Western imperial power, right? We were from very beginning of the time we were strongly against anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism. Why? Because we ourselves were the victim of those ideology, right? And at the end, the sensitive exposure of all forms of racial, social, and economic discrimination, right? We strongly criticized the Britons for its apartheid and racial discrimination in Africa, right? So these are some of the important assessment, right? So it was only after it became independent in 1947 that India began to evolve its own foreign policy in light of its requirement and prevailing international situation, right? Not very important. Since its independence, India's foreign policy advocated the principle of friendship, cooperation with all the countries of the world, irrespective of their political system, right? So we have followed a path of non-alignment, right? Non-alignment, right? So there is a stark difference between non-alignment and NAM-friends, right? Make sure that you don't get confused between these two terminology. Non-alignment is a foreign policy, right? Foreign policy of not taking side between the two major power blocks. But when we talk about NAM, that is non-aligned movement, it is a global grouping, right? It is a global groupings like countries like India, the Middle Asian countries, the Egypt, and few South African countries. We have made a groupings, right? with the founding fathers like Jawaharlal Nehru in order to promote the idea of non-alignment, right, and not siding with the any of the major power. So NAM is a global grouping, right, that is non-aligned movement, and non-alignment is a foreign policy, right. So post-independence, India's foreign policy was of non-alignment, right, that is principle of friendship and cooperation with all the countries rather than siding with any of the two major power bloc, right. So especially the establishment of friendly relation with the neighboring countries was the principal plank of India's foreign policy, right? We have the policy of look east policy, right? Look east policy, where we have given a main emphasis on the India's neighborhood, right? Because we have understood the importance of the neighborhood since very early of our foreign policy, right? So post independence, we had followed the principle of non-alignment, right? Because India, why this is also one of the very important reason why did India followed a principle of non-alignment. Had we sided with USA, we might have been in better position. Some of the scholars they say this, right? Have we sided with USA rather than inclining towards Soviet, we would have been in better position, right? So this is what some of the critics of non-alignment foreign policy they quote. But what was the reason? What was the raison d'etre? What was the rational or rationality behind the principle of non-alignment post-independence? Because India achieved its independence during the time when Cold War clouds were already looming large globe, right? There was a huge consequences which was caused because of Cold War and major power bloc that was divided between USA and Russia, right? As a result, it was not only undergoing but also experienced the power politics of the superpowers, right? So as we have already discussed in the yesterday class, that people or the countries who have sided with the two blocks that were USA and USSR, they might have achieved military economic prowess, but they have compromised their sovereignty. They have compromised their sovereignty, and that is where India was most aware of this idea, right? That we don't want to lose our sovereignty. Why? Because India has got its own set of issues, right? India got issues like poverty, malnutrition, and all the internal stripes because of partition that were happening in our country. So if we would have been sided with any one of those countries or power bloc, that is USA or USSR, we would have lost our sovereignty to solve our internal domestic power, right? Whatever the dictum or decree would have been passed by those, like let's say if we would have been sided with USA, whatever dictum would have been passed by USA, we would have to follow that. We do not have any other option, right? So our sovereignty would have been compromised. That is where the very strategist prime minister, that is Jawaharlal Nehru, he came up with the policy of non-alignment, right? So this naturally made India formulate her foreign policy on lines with non-involvement and non-alignment that became the basis principles of India's foreign policy. All right, so with this we are done with today's lecture, friends. We have seen how the foreign policy of India from very ancient civilization to the present time evolved, right? So with this, thank you so much for watching, champs. If you guys have liked the particular lecture, then please ensure to show your love by liking, subscribing, and sharing this particular lecture with your close ones, right, who might get benefit out of watching this. So keep watching, keep learning with Executive IAS. Until next time, this is your host, friend, and guide signing off.